Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the Consistory, a video podcast produced by the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Now, today's question is not one that was actually sent in, it's just one that I thought I would address, which is how do we as Christians deal with this whole coronavirus pandemic? So, this is the big panic at the moment. Everybody's worried about coronavirus. Countries are shutting down. Economies are shutting down. What are we? So to answer this question, I thought I'd just look at what Martin Luther said concerning the bubonic plague that went through Europe in his days and what his response was to that pandemic. And so we're going to look at what Martin Luther said. And to do that, we're going to have a look at Martin Luther's Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague. Now, I'm not going to read the entire letter for this video because it's a rather long letter and I want to keep the video as short as possible, so I'm only going to basically give a brief summary over it, and I just want to directly read one section of it, which I think will specifically help a lot of Christians to deal with this question about how do we respond to coronavirus. And I'll pop a link to this letter in the description below, so keep an eye out for that if you want to read the entire letter. So Luther says that there are basically two errors or sins that people commit with pandemics like this, and one is people who flee their post, and the other one is people who just don't take it seriously. And so the first one that Luther really kind of addresses with most of the letter is people who flee this when they have an office that they should be holding and staying in. So people that are like doctors or government or the military or police, or he says even pastors. Because you have an office and you have a responsibility to those people that you're meant to serve. As a government, you have to serve your subjects. As doctors, you serve your patients. As pastors, you serve your congregants and parishioners. And Luther says, these people, you have a responsibility to stay and care for those in need. Luther says that during these pandemics, people who hold these offices have a responsibility to stay and look after the people that they're meant to look after. And therefore, they sin if they flee, if they run away, if they don't make an effort to help their people. So, yeah, that's one sin. Luther does answer the question then if he goes, what about the average person? Can they flee a plague? So, like, can I up and run and flee to another city to avoid getting the plague? Luther said, of course. I mean, if you've got an office that needs to be filled, then you have to stay put, and you would sin in fleeing. But as for the average person that doesn't have to stay and fill an office, can they flee? Can they run away from a virus and a plague? Well, Luther says, of course they can. He says, to flee from death and to save one's life is a natural tendency implanted by God and not forbidden by God. As St. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 29, no man ever hates his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it. He says, it is even commanded that every man should as much as possible preserve body and life and not neglect them, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12, that God has so ordered the members of the body that each one cares and works for the other. So yeah, for the average person, you can flee from a plague or a virus, but if you've got an office, you have to stay. As Luther says, the person who disregards God and neighbor and flees when they should stay, they sin in the left hand. But, he goes on, there is also the sin of people that treat pandemics and plagues and viruses carelessly and don't take them seriously. And for this, I want to basically read a large chunk of what Luther says, because he just says basically so much here that I think is valuable and important to this topic. So Luther says, others sin on the right hand. They are much too rash and reckless, tempting God and disregarding everything which might counteract death and the plague. They disdain the use of medicines. They do not avoid places and persons infected by the plague, but light-heartedly make sport of it and wish to prove how independent they are. They say that it is God's punishment. If he wants to protect them, then he can do so without medicines or without our carefulness. This is not trusting God, but is tempting God. God has created medicines and provided us with intelligence to guard and take good care of the body so that we can live in good health. If one makes no use of intelligence or medicine when he could do so without detriment to his neighbor, such a person injures his body and must beware lest he becomes a suicide in God's eyes. By the same reasoning, a person might forgo eating and drinking, clothing and shelter, and boldly proclaim his faith that if God wanted to preserve him from starvation and the cold, then he would do so without food and clothing. Actually, that would be considered suicide. It is even more shameful for a person to pay no heed to his own body and to fail to protect it against the plague the best he is able, and then to infect and poison others who might have remained alive if he had taken care of his body as he should have. He is thus responsible before God for his neighbor's death, and he is a murderer many times over. Indeed, such people behave as though a house were burning in a city and nobody were trying to put the fire out. Instead, they give leeway to the flames so that the whole city is consumed, saying that if God so willed, he could save the city without water to quench the fire. No, my dear friends, that is no good. Use medicine. Take potions which can help you. Fumigate house, yard, and street. Shun persons and places where your neighbor does not need your presence or has recovered, and act like a man who wants to help put out the burning city. What else is the epidemic but a fire that instead of consuming wood and straw devours life and body? You ought to think thus. Very well. By God's decree, the enemy has sent us poison and deadly offal. Therefore I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed, in order not to become contaminated and thus perchance infect and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. If God should wish to take me, he will surely find me, and I have done what he has expected me, and so I am not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but will go freely as stated above. See, this is such a God-fearing faith, because it is neither brash nor foolhardy, and it does not tempt God. So what Luther basically says here is that we need to use our intelligence and our common sense to not spread diseases. That would be, if we spread diseases to others, that would make us a murderer, and if we are careless in trying to keep ourselves healthy, that would make us a suicide in God's eyes, because we are not taking care of our body as we should. So basically, we need to use some intelligence and some common sense and try to not get sick ourselves and not spread the disease. If God wants to take us or others, he will do so. But we do have the responsibility to not assist the disease in spreading. So as Christians, we shouldn't just carelessly go, well, it's God's will, so if he wants me to die, or he wants others to die, or if he wants to protect them, he'll just do what he wants. I can just go and do whatever I want regardless. No, that's not what God tells us to do. See, as Christians, we need to be careful not to fall between the two errors of the clockmaker God of the deists and the puppet master God of the Calvinists. So the watchmaker God of the deists says that God doesn't really care about the creation, he doesn't interact with creation, he just creates us and lets us go. Whereas the Calvinists have this puppet master God where they focus on God's sovereignty and basically say that anything that happens is God's will. As Lutherans, we like to fall in a bit of a middle ground where we say that God isn't a puppet master. He gives us free will. He doesn't control absolutely everything. He does interfere from time to time, and he does have his hand and providence in the creation, but he doesn't force us like puppets. And so God has given us the command and the common sense to take care of our body and to take care of the bodies of our neighbors. The fifth commandment, you shall not murder, says that you need to look after your neighbor's well-being. And so being careless and spreading disease is not really looking after your neighbor's well-being. So we need to be careful and not help spread the disease. Luther also says, though, that we need to, if our neighbor needs us, go to them, rush them, not worry about our own health and safety, but if our neighbor needs us, go and help them and serve them. And so this leads to the question of how are Christians to respond to all these kind of shutdowns that the government are doing? I don't know how it's going in other countries, but in Australia they've now closed churches. You can't have gatherings. Gatherings over 100 are banned. Some councils are banning gatherings of more than 10 people. So how are Christians to answer this question, especially what about gathering for Sunday? Well, the thing is, as Christians, we need to understand that there's a difference between necessity and inconvenience, and there's a difference between inconvenience and persecution. The government is not saying you can't be Christian, it's not saying you can't worship God, it's just putting restrictions on types of gatherings. And so, as Christians, there's the whole we need to obey God rather than man. Yes, but if we can obey both God and man, we should do that. So, if you can obey God and still worship God, and you can also obey the government and, worship within these kind of restricted situations, you should do both. If the government is going to stop you from worshipping God, stop you from having Holy Communion, stop you from having baptisms, well, then you must defy the government and do those things. But if the government is putting certain restrictions that can be obeyed and still be able to worship God, then we must obey God and man. We must both worship God, but also follow these certain restrictions that the government is putting in place. So, house churches are a good idea. In the Soviet era in Russia, Christians were just banned from worshipping God in general, and so they defied the government and worshipped, but mass public gatherings were banned in communist countries. So the Christians would have secret house churches, and the pastors would just go from house to house. In fact, in the early days of the church, in the book of Acts, it says that the apostles went from house to house, worshipping, preaching, and teaching, giving communion, and stuff like that. So we may need to go back to that era where Christians are going to have house churches, and the pastors are going to have to make the effort to go and see their parishioners and travel from house to house to give them communion. Plus, in the age we live at now, we can have Skype services, and we can have video recordings and audio recordings of sermons and stuff like that. So we're in a situation where, yes, it is inconvenient that you can't have 200 members meet in one location for church, but we need to obey both God and man. And an inconvenience is not the same thing as persecution or a necessity. The Bible does not say that we have to have a gathering of 200 people in order for that to be church. No, Jesus says where 2 or 3 are gathered, there is church. There he is with them. So best answer is to try and have small gatherings and have as many as you can. And pastors, you need to go and see your parishioners. Take communion to them. Luther said in his letter here that as a pastor, you have the responsibility to continue to serve your parishioners and your congregations during these pandemics. And so if that means you have to, get off your backside and go traveling around and visiting like 30 homes a day in order to give everyone communion, so be it. That is your responsibility, and that is your calling as pastor. Sure, it seems inconvenient, but we need to do what we need to do in order to bring people the word and the sacraments. So, this is kind of the best advice I can give regarding this whole corona pandemic. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. Hope it's been helpful. Check out the rest of the videos done by the consistory. I'll see you again next time. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.